Hello, my name is Caleb Azor and I'm from Auckland, New Zealand. So today I'm going to be talking about pests, pest trees particularly, and essentially challenging the idea of pests, particularly pest trees. A lot of people consider um, pests as anything or consider anything that reproduces prolifically and or grows fast as a pest. Um, so if it's a tree that seeds itself all over the place and has lots of seedlings surviving to adulthood, and or it's a fast-growing tree in which seedlings that do survive shoot up into full-size trees very quickly, and that would be a pest tree. A pest plant could be just any other kind of plant that behaves in a similar manner, and then often animals that do that would be considered pests. But here's a good example of a animal um, that does that isn't a pest. Oh, and please note that if a native species of any country does that, it is never considered a pest, unless you're a gardener or a farmer or whatever, and you go, oh, this plant is a pest in my garden, or this animal's a pest on my farm, or whatever. But as a conservation, environmental perspective, no one ever considers native species pests. So they can do that all they like, but that's okay. But if an exotic species to that environment does that, then it's usually considered a pest. So a great example of a animal species in New Zealand that is not native and that does that is clearly not a pest would be blackbirds. Blackbirds can have several clutches of chicks every year, and they normally have one or two of their babies surviving to adulthood every year, and the next season those chicks will be old enough will be fully grown and able to have their own chicks. So they reproduce very quickly and they grow very quickly. However, they're certainly not pests, because the idea people have that anything that reproduces quickly or grows quickly is a pest. To me, that isn't what would define what a pest is. And I'll just please note that these are my own thoughts on the matter, not based on science. It's based on observations and thinking about the way these things work. So to me, a pest is not that, because the blackbirds, they do that, and yet they're not pests. So why? Well, what do? Blackbirds live mainly in gardens here in Auckland. They're like urban areas, predominantly. Disturbed, very mixed habitats where lots of native and exotic species live side by side in great numbers. And they also do, I know, go into bush sometimes, native bush, and live there. And they live just fine there. But they don't really outcompete any native species. They don't, or any other species for that matter. They don't particularly predate on any native species in a harmful manner, more than native birds would do, and then therefore those species can handle. So like insects, they're predatory. They eat worms and insects and things, but they don't predate too heavily on anything. They don't outcompete anything. They don't destroy habitat anyway. They're very, very adaptable species, so they can just move into whatever habitat's there, fit into the food chain however it exists, and they don't have any particular predators other than uh, what the natures have, the introduced predators. So it's to do with what the species does. So then there's a lot of plant and tree species that are considered pests. All of these are considered pests because of, almost all of these are considered pests simply because of reproducing quickly and or growing quickly. Now, there are a lot of species that are genuine pests. There are quite a few species that are genuine pests, like genuine pests such as, say, kikuyu. It's an exotic rhizomous grass that spreads over the ground and forms a mat that prevents any trees, native or exotic, from growing. And so I would definitely consider that to be a pest. If anything is a pest, then that's definitely a pest. So it's what they do, kikuyu. It's what it does is that it smothers anything else from growing and prevents anything else from growing, and basically it creates a field that cannot be that nothing else can grow in, and then prevents environment, it damages the environment, preventing regeneration of forests, and creates a really monotonous environment of just one plant species, and just maybe a few other things that are tough surviving here and there amongst it. So that is a pest. But then there'll be other exotic plant species and tree species that are not like that, and particularly when it comes to trees, because there might be more plants like kikuyu that do create smothering or be more aggressive in growth, in which they do actually compete with each other, whereas trees, they tend not to compete with each other, they tend to work together. And maybe there are a few species that actually do compete, but as far as I'm aware, that all the ones that I know of, they work together and they grow as a forest. And so they don't compete with each other. So the trees might suppress lower vegetation, but not other trees, and they still create plenty of habitat, and so it's something all trees do, exotic and native. Although some trees will suppress more than others of ground vegetation, but typically what they suppress is things like kikuyu and weeds like that, which are actual weeds that grow and suppress other vegetation, particularly trees, and create an environment that doesn't have so much habitat, because most like bird life and things require trees and just some under-vegetation as well, but a whole field of weeds is not really a great habitat for most plants and animals, except for the weeds, obviously. So, to me, there aren't really any tree species that are true weeds. There are some plant species that are true weeds, or pests, and there are certainly animal species that are pests, such as stoats and weasels and ferrets and rats and mice can be quite bad pests in our bush, and they terrible predation for our native bird life and other wildlife. But when it comes to plant species, there's a lot that is a pest, and obviously there's a lot of animal species that aren't pests, like blackbirds. But trees, when it comes to trees, I don't really think that there are any truly pest species trees. So in New Zealand, we have privet. There's obviously privet's a whole genus, there's several different species. And so these privets, the tree privet and the Japanese privet, they reproduce very quickly, and they grow very quickly. They're some of the fastest reproducing, fastest growing trees that I know. And we have them all over the place in New Zealand. And they are very definitely considered to be pests by most people. And I take them as example because they are the most extreme example. There are lots of things that that are less extreme, and that obviously applies to them as well, that are considered pests. And there's a lot of things also that are considered pests in New Zealand that aren't actually pests at all. They don't even reproduce quickly or grow quickly. So yes, it can get pretty silly with considering things pests in New Zealand, which is quite sad. But when it comes to trees, these privet, so they're reproducing quickly and they're growing quickly. But what are they doing? What they're doing is what defines to me whether they're pests or not. And they are not actually, like I said, they're not competing other trees. They just, so far as I have observed, they will simply grow in a forest with other trees. They typically don't, so far as I have observed, seed out into native bush or into natural forest habitats. They tend to seed into gardens, parks, roadside banks, cliff areas, so human areas and disturbed areas such as the roadside banks and cliffs, and areas that basically just not many things grow there because they're harsh environments and they're disturbed either by people, and sometimes in the cases of things like seaside cliffs, they'll be disturbed by nature itself, or the elements, and so rather than people. These privet trees, they're much tougher and hardier, faster growing and faster reproducing, so they can colonize banks, roadside banks, and roadside ditches, railway line edges, and cliffs, just old abandoned building sites, or ruined buildings, or just abandoned pieces of land, and they can colonize them, and they can tolerate things like the kikuyu and other weeds that suppress trees far better than other trees can, and so they can get a grip into places that other trees can't. And once they establish themselves, then it makes it easier for other trees to grow. And like I said, most trees grow fine with other trees, so they don't compete too much, so far as I'm aware, with any other trees. Or sorry, they don't compete at all with other trees, so far as I'm aware. They simply grow side by side as a forest, working together. And then the mature trees will encourage younger trees to grow of any species, and make it easier for the younger trees to grow. I've talked about this before, and the way they work together. And so once a few trees like the privet get a grip into a roadside bank, then it suddenly becomes far easier for trees of all species to begin to colonize. Now obviously people and gardeners might think, and maybe even farmers would think that privets are such a terrible pest because they don't want young trees popping up in their garden that, if you don't notice it in the bushes, it could pop up into a full-size tree in not too long. And in farmland they could start colonizing fields, which farmers don't necessarily want. But as from a conservation environmental perspective, they are not actually pests. They may be a weed in gardens and farms, but they're not really pests because they not actually are competing anything or destroying anything. They're simply colonizing areas that are not good habitat and helping them to become better habitat for all plants. And I've even seen on one cliff, not a very steep cliff, like it's more of a steep bank cliff sort of area, where there were quite a few large privet trees, and they were quite big. They were like maybe 10 meters high at least, and underneath was a vast array of native vegetation growing just fine. So they clearly weren't suppressing the native vegetation. They were holding the cliff together to prevent against landslide, and they were creating the over canopy where a lot of bird life and animal life lived. They basically playing a very key role in that habitat. And I would guess that initially that would have been a fairly bare, barren area, and the tree privet colonized it, and then over time, as they've got bigger and formed a good habitat, more native vegetation has moved in and more native wildlife has moved in. So that just a great example of how things that are commonly considered to be pests aren't necessarily pests at all. Yeah.